What do we do in 2050 if we have well-built cities but a weak economy because of an underdeveloped workforce? This may seem like a far-fetched idea, but I don't think it is. With Citibank estimating that over the last 20 years, the US has lost $16 trillion in its GDP solely because of racial inequality. And with the fact that it's estimated that by the year 2050, the majority of the adult population in the US will be people of color, it's evident that we need a new approach. A new approach that helps us more effectively measure how cities create a pipeline for inclusive growth, which is why I recommend that Bloomberg Philanthropies develops the Pathways to 2050 Index that will do exactly this, help cities understand how they can build a pathway for inclusive growth. In doing this, the index will work alongside existing programs within Bloomberg Philanthropies and using three components to do this. The first component is actually youth-centered. And so why are youth an important index in helping us understand how we build a more equitable future in cities? Well, one, it's because youth are an excellent proxy for what's happening in communities. So when we hear that 1 in 6 children are living food insecure, those kids are not living on their own. They're living in families that lack the money to get food, and they're living in communities that have limited access to resources. So as we measure what's happening with youth along the entire cradle to career continuum, it allows us to plan today for the issues that we can do to impact not only youth, but their families and the entire community. The second reason why creating a cradle to career baseline on any index is critically important as we think about how we move forward with equity is because youth are also a great opportunity for us to think through what does it mean to mitigate inequality in the long term. You see, the cradle to career continuum is something that already exists. Schools are using it, communities use it to understand what's happening along the entire continuum of a child's life. In fact, California has recently developed an entire data system to help them understand how schools can more effectively develop the entire continuum to get youth into college. And so when we understand what's happening from prenatal all the way to career readiness, we're able to map what we can do today in order to better impact youth for the future. If you're familiar with what the Human Capital Index does with the World Bank, it's exactly this. It looks over the course of 6 indicators for youth and establishes what we do with youth today. What will that mean for the country in the next 18 years when that cohort becomes adults? And how effectively will the country have productivity? And so I recommend that we do this on a smaller scale, looking at cities, being able to look on the long-term time horizon and measure how exactly we are working with youth in order to ensure that when they become adults, we've built the types of pipelines across all residents in cities that make it more equitable. The second component to this is evaluating the roots. And so typically when we look at programs like job placement or measuring 8th grade reading levels, unemployment, it's essentially assessing how we can better invest in the fruit. So if we think about a tree as a city, we have to do more than just look at the branches and the fruit and what we do there, but we have to go deeper. And that's where we really need to evaluate what's happening in the roots. It's the city infrastructure that creates a lot of the inequality that we see, not just the outcomes of individuals like their ability to read or get jobs. And so when we think about issues with employment, it's not just creating workforce readiness that we have to do. It's also ensuring that as we graduate people, they're going back to communities that have transportation for them to get to the jobs that we prepared them for. It's quality healthcare, it's housing policies, and all these things happen below the surface that we typically don't see. And so as we begin to measure how we more effectively approach inequality, we can't just look at the outcomes and the individual measures. We have to look at the roots. This not only helps us in ensuring what we do today, but it also allows us to think more critically about how we use our resources. Because when we can address the underlying structural issues, it actually improves multiple facets of what we see on the outside. And so that brings me to the third thing that this does, and that's mapping and simulating. The reason why mapping is so critically important when we look at an index is because information is great, but if we don't have the ability to apply it, then it does nothing for us. And that's why as this initiative develops an index that measures what's happening at the roots, using youth as a primary indicator, and then building on top of that all the issues that are happening within the civic infrastructure. We have to provide cities the ability to really map what they can do. And actually, Bloomberg Philanthropies is already doing this with the government innovation initiatives. They're working with cities to better assess how they use data to support all residents. And so what I think is what we need to do is go further with that, not only certifying cities, which is what the initiative already does, but ensuring that cities are able to see all of the aspects of how they contribute. So for example, recent research demonstrated that if Chicago were less segregated, it could see $4.4 billion in additional income every year, lower homicide rates, and more bachelor's degrees. What if we had a measure that helped us understand all the underlying factors that contribute to this, and then we're able to work with Chicago in order to assess not only the policies that need to change, but the types of public-private partnerships that contribute to this? How much would it reduce duplicate efforts? How much would we be able to plan better the business initiatives in order to improve the city, not just the policy changes that we need? And that's why I believe developing an index that looks holistically at the systems and on a long-term trajectory will help us not only address the issues of inequality that we see today, but also tomorrow. Why is this so important? Well, the pandemic last year demonstrated exactly what happens when we don't invest in all residents. It not only impacts the people who experience inequality, it impacts the entire city, our infrastructure, our economy, the health and well-being, and the social structure. And so that is why it's critical to do this today. So it's not a question of how we change the policy and how we invest more in understanding what's happening. It's really a question of, can we afford not to?